Hi, and welcome to week 10, assessment. This week, your only reading is from your book, and I really would like you to look really carefully at your book. I'll reference some of the figures and sections in this presentation so that you know some especially important ones to look at. You're going to watch two videos. One is elementary, I think, and one is middle school, but both of them are things that could be applied up and down in terms of the application for different grade levels. You have two activities. One is an activity where I'll ask you to look at your book and your and a website that I've given you. And I want you to think about two examples of authentic summative assessment and identify kind of why you would use them and when you would use them in your classrooms. And then I also have a website for you to look at for formative assessment, where you'll pick 3 formative assessment methods that you want to use regularly and share those in your form post. And on that one, it's really important. A lot of formative assessments have kind of a physical shape to them in the form of a picture or a PDF. Some of them are just things that you're informally doing in your classroom. So in the event that you select ones that have a PDF or a Word document that would go with them, like an exit slip or a graphic organizer, I'd like you to attach those to your post so that we can kind of learn and share from each other the different formative assessment methods that are appropriate for science. So let's start right out then with what the purpose of assessment is. And we're going to kind of go through some questions here. What are we looking for when we're assessing? Why do we assess? What's formative assessment? What's summative assessment? And what should we actually be assessing? And I love this cartoon because I think, a lot of times this is what we're doing. When we assess, we're teachers kind of standing around our students saying, how do we know it's not empty? How do we know there's something in there? And so I want you to kind of keep that image in mind as we go through this time talking about assessment, of answering that oftentimes we're answering the question of how do we know that they know something? How do we know that there's something going on inside? So let's start right off then with what are we looking for when we assess? Broadly, we can say the purpose of assessment is to generate evidence that allows us to evaluate what students know. The key here is that assessment is just generating evidence. And no matter what, kind of like that cartoon of the people trying to figure out if the safe is empty, we can't get inside to see. It's not like we can do a scan of kids' brains to figure out what's in there. Instead, we have to find different pieces of evidence that would give us some idea of what they do and don't know about whatever it is we're trying to assess. In a lot of ways, you could say that when we assign grades, we're going through the same claims, evidence, and reasoning process we ask our students to go through when they are writing and in science and having that scientific reasoning and argumentation. We have a claim about what we think they know, and that's why we're assigning a grade. We have evidence from a variety of assessments, kind of our assessment system in our classroom, and we're using reasoning to tie that evidence to some achievement level that we're using that grade to indicate. And I really like the image here of the fingerprint because it reminds me that just like we leave traces of ourselves everywhere we go, our students are leaving traces of themselves throughout the classroom. Our job in developing an assessment system for our classrooms is to give them plenty of opportunity to leave those traces of evidence, showing what they know and can do in relation to science. And I think that's a really important kind of frame of mind to be thinking of, to just be thinking of how do I give them the opportunity to leave that trail. And that it's our job as teachers to make those opportunities. It's their job as students to take advantage of those opportunities. Every week when I put together the questions for you to answer, I'm looking for ways, how can I give you an opportunity to not just show me what you know, but to do it in a meaningful way you can use in your classroom later. With our students, we don't necessarily need to worry the way that I'm worrying about you having these concrete packets of information you can take into your classroom for teaching science. We're more worried that they have this knowledge and information and these skills to take to the next grade level. And it's really our job to give us the chance to show us so that we can do reteaching and give them more opportunities if it's missing. So that kind of leads us to this question of why do we assess? This is a really dorky cartoon in terms of the artwork on it, but I love this question. Is the assessment about the learning or is it about the score? And I think that that fundamental question right there answers, the answer to that question really determines whether we're going to have a successful assessment plan in our classroom and whether we're going to be able to really get our kids to the place that we want them to be, because it should be about the learning. So on some level, though, from a broader picture, we assess because of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Often you'll see that referred to as ESEA. That's the policy that guides all of the funding and regulations around elementary K-12 education. Also, there's the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB or NICLB. You'll hear it both ways, which tells us about the No Child Left Behind legislation was introduced to talk about achievement levels and ensure that different groups of students weren't being kind of left in the cracks of our assessment system, especially minority students who might not show up statistically unless we single them out. And for those purposes, it is about a score. But hopefully we're able to see how that score represents learning. And I do actually want to share a little bit about my experience with ESEA and NICLB before I went and back to graduate school and then went to work for the state. I taught high school science, and I taught high school science in Texas, where assessment is a huge, huge deal. And it was around the time when No Child Left Behind went into effect, and our school was very, very badly hit by NICLB, or No Child Left Behind. It really damaged our accreditation level and our standing. The interesting thing about that, I was responsible for doing test prep to help the students who were likely to fail the standardized test to try and get them all passing. And I was able to learn a lot about how the law, as it was interpreted specifically in Texas, affected schools. And the reality is that the law itself essentially says if there's any subgroup within your school that's statistically significant, so it can't just be that you have one student, but if there's any subgroup in your school that's significant, they need to be performing just as high as the rest of your school building. So in the example of the school that I taught in Texas, it was in the suburbs of Dallas. It was a blue ribbon school in a fairly wealthy community. However, even though we had 99% passing and like 60% mastery level on our science test, we were no longer at the highest level of accreditation in Texas because our African American students were only 70% passing. Our free and reduced lunch students were only, I think it was 65% passing, or free and reduced was 80% passing, and our special needs students who took the regular test were 65% passing. Because we had enough students in any of those groups to be significant, that mattered. Obviously, they weren't a large percentage of our school, and clearly, if we look at that building, the rich, white students without disabilities were far outperforming their minority peers. So that's the intention of No Child Left Behind, and it gets a lot of bad press, and I'm not saying the law is perfect, but I do want you to understand as you enter a system that has these standardized tests that kind of put a lot of pressure on the system, to have a better sense of where it comes from sometimes I think helps us to adjust our teaching in ways that isn't quite teaching to the test, but maybe respects the origin of the rules. So separate from all of those things about testing and holding teachers and schools accountable for this idea that students should be able to produce a certain level of evidence, because we're going to talk about assessment in terms of producing evidence. Separate from producing evidence on mandated tests, we also want to assess to help students to understand what they know, to help ourselves understand what they know so that we can impact the learning process. So we hear a lot about summative and formative assessment in education. As we move into a new testing system for the state of Montana, we're actually going to have some really structured support for both summative and formative assessment. The important thing to remember, though, when you hear those terms and when you think about your assessment plan for your classroom, is to remember that the difference between them is about two things. Why did we give the test, and what are we going to do with the results or the feedback? Okay, to what degree is it about the learning? Is it about just knowing what they learned, or is it about impacting what they learned? Okay, and whatever our purpose is, we should always be very intentional about our assessment choices. There are lots of factors to consider. The reality is that among these factors, providing students with assessment experiences that will serve them well as they move through the education system is really important. I'm not advocating for teaching to the test. However, I think it's really important to understand that beyond your classroom, there's going to be another grade level, and beyond that, another grade level, and eventually beyond that is a college or a career. And being really aware of how your assessment practices that you're selecting help your students to understand their own learning, to show their own evidence, and be prepared for what's going to come next is really important. And so, ensuring those things are developmentally appropriate. It's not appropriate to give something that looks like the state bar to a fourth grader, because they're not trying to be a lawyer. Make sure that it's developmentally appropriate, but be aware of kind of the different assessment environments that students will encounter in their life. So let's talk specifically about summative assessment. Summative assessments are the assessments we give to determine what a student knows so that we can move on. Okay. Some examples of summative assessments that are pretty classic are state standardized tests, or district standardized tests, unit or chapter exams, semester, end of the year exams. There are some things that we can do with all of those examples to make them inform our instruction and inform our learning. But ultimately, the test was written to tell us what that child knows before we moved on, before the next grade, before the next unit, before the next semester. So when we think about elementary, we don't have quite as much summative assessment as secondary and post-secondary have. However, given that the distinction between summative and formative assessment is tied to the process, it's not about how big the assessment is. It's about why we're doing it. So we do have some summative assessments in elementary. At the end of a science unit, you would still have some summative assessment to see if students have mastered the content. I know my son in elementary school has a spelling test each week that is essentially summative assessment. They don't revisit the words. He's had a week to learn them, and he will then be assessed on them. So those types of tests are functioning as formative assessment. Or summative assessment, sorry. For elementary science, I'd like you to think of summative assessment as what you use to provide the opportunity for students to demonstrate that they understand the content and can use the practices, and in that way have met the objective. And this is something that's really important for your lesson plans, this idea that your objective is directly tied to your assessment. Okay, so it may be that your objective is my students will know X, Y, Z, and so your assessment is just an opportunity for them to show you that they know that. Sometimes your objective says, I want them to show me that they can do X, Y, Z. That means that your summative assessment needs to give them the opportunity to show that they can do that. On the flip side, if your assessment is something that's about practice or performance, your objective should really recognize that that's the context in which they're going to need to show you their knowledge. So in elementary, I want you to really think that in every lesson, I have an objective, and that means that I should have something that's functioning as that summative assessment that lets me and my student know if they've met my objective. And I don't want to imply that there never are objectives that can be met through formative assessment, but ultimately each unit should have a summative piece or a capstone piece. So students might do summative assessment independently through paper pencil style tests. That's definitely an option. But they can also do it through other authentic experiences. Sometimes we call this authentic assessment, sometimes non-traditional assessment. I like the idea of calling it authentic assessment because that kind of speaks to the student-centered nature of it. One of your activities for this week is actually to identify 2 summative assessment practices that you can use at your grade point. There's some good examples in your book. And I want you to look at those carefully. I've also given you this website to this faculty members page. He has a collection here of examples that have been written by his graduate students that you can look through and see. So there are some that are specific to science, some that are more general. But I want you to think about 2 summative assessment practices that you think you could use in your class, and you're going to have to give me an example of when you think you might use that. So there are some content pieces that are better for some practices than, or some assessment types than others. Formative assessment, we often call this the formative assessment process, and it really is a process. And I love this quote. It takes a great deal of support and courage for teachers to turn around their practices from being test-oriented to being learning-oriented. And really that's what we do when we begin to rely on formative assessments. Instead of having it be that all of my energy is just focused on this summative capstone test, which I do need to have some summative measure of my students' knowledge and skills. Instead, I'm going to have all of these assessment points leading up to that that are formative in nature and allow us to adjust our teaching and allow students to adjust their learning while that process is still happening. In theory, this helps us to avoid the idea of reteaching. It helps us to avoid having students wanting to come in and make up work. And it serves as a practice for the student and a check for understanding. So there are lots of opinions and resources about formative assessment, and I just have a few key things I want you to remember. And your book doesn't cover formative assessment. I thought about assigning a reading, but I'm very hopeful that you've learned about formative assessment in other courses. So number 1, I want you to know that as a teacher, you should be looking for concrete ways for students to show you what they're understanding during the lesson. So as you think about planning your lesson and the lesson plan that you're writing, think about critical times when adjustments could occur, either in your teaching or their learning. So at what point might they have an opportunity for some independent study that they would make different choices if they were able to see what they didn't understand before they went into that point? Or maybe when is there a time when you have an opportunity for reteach coming up, or you have an opportunity to provide an alternate assignment to somebody who maybe needs to recover some critical material that they're missing? So look for those times in your lesson plan and build in a formative assessment process or formative assessment tool at that point as a checkpoint. So an example that I can think of this is that after the hands-on portion of a lab is ended, before they're going to do an individual write-up, have students get together with a partner that wasn't in their group and talk about their lab findings. The thing that would be fantastic about doing this and kind of how you would set that up is that if my group had different findings than your group and we're talking, now I know that one of our 2 groups might not be right. So clearly you wouldn't use this with a hands-on activity that had a really open-ended answer. It would need to be something where kids are reaching some definitive conclusions. For example, that if I pushed it harder, it went further, those types of conclusions. Then the class can have a discussion about if they learned something from their partner. It helps you get a sense of whether everyone's on the right track, and it helps individual lab groups get a sense of whether they might have gone wrong somewhere and have some extra things to explain in their write-up. So let's say that the lab was one where students could articulate that they discovered that a stronger push made it go farther. You could actually have them fill out a Venn diagram with their partner, where one circle is things that I discovered, the other is things my partner discovered, the overlap being things that we both discovered. If they have a lot of stuff out in those outer rims, they know that something might be off with one of the 2 groups. The class discussion helps them to identify which group has some explaining to do. So that's just one example of a way that, that lab report is maybe a big grade in the grade book, that you give them an opportunity to check in before they go back to write. The second thing that I want to say about formative assessment is that there are a lot of observational techniques you can use as an informal formative assessment. In fact, some places when you read about formative assessment, that's the whole focus, is things like raising the whiteboard so you can see the answers, different color cards. You'll see that in one of the videos. The process of observing the classroom and interacting with students is a key aspect of making those small adjustments in the lesson and knowing what information to share next with students. And every time we ask a student a question, it helps us to know something about how things are going and how we can adjust. So all of those observational techniques that you'll see and read about are important to understand, as, they almost function as classroom management in some ways. However, those aren't the only type of formative assessment. The third thing that I want to say about formative assessment is that there can be kind of a gray area. Sometimes there are assessments that our school or district asks us to use that are intended as summative assessments. They want us to put a grade on it. Many of those actually are excellent opportunities to use the formative process, though. That doesn't make the unit test a formative assessment or a formal lab report a formative assessment, but you should never stop using that process of helping kids to think about what they understand, helping yourself to think about where the kids are and how you need to adjust your teaching. Just because there's a summative purpose guiding the assessment doesn't mean you can't apply some of the ideas of formative assessment to your process. And then last, one of the best things you can do with formative assessment in your classroom is select a few types of formative assessment that involve the students and that you will use on a regular basis. It helps the students by providing some stability and predictability in your classroom. If my students know they'll always be doing an exit slip, and I use that consistently and have the same version all the time, it will really help them. Or if they know that, every unit there's going to be a time when we do think, pair, share, so I can check my knowledge, or if we're always going to have the same graphic organizer to check our knowledge, they're able to focus just on what they know and understand, not learning a new process all the time. So it's a really good idea to select. That doesn't mean you can't use different processes sometimes, but to select a few processes that are going to be your focus areas for your instruction. One of your activities this week is to use the West Virginia Department of Education's website to identify 3 formative assessment practices that you'll integrate into your science classroom. You'll either create materials or create a description of what you're going to do. And these might be things you'd use for other content areas, but in this form, I want you to really explain how you'll use them in relation to science instruction. The next question that we want to talk about is what we're assessing. So the conversation so far has really been about summative and formative assessment centered around the idea of content knowledge. In our current culture, this is a vital part of what we assess. And we really need to ensure that our students meet specific objectives for some pieces of content. However, that's not the only thing that's important for us to be assessing. Both formative and summatively in the elementary classroom, we could be looking at some other things like science process skills, or the science and engineering practices, or the inquiry cycle, or even science lab safety. Your book does a great job addressing the question of what else we would want to assess students on, and it provides some checklists for observing these other features. The checklists are called indicators of proficiency, or checklists or rubrics. Again, with these, we're looking for evidence in our students' behavior that they understand something. So let's say we took the science process skill of observation. What evidence would we see in a student's behavior to show that they really truly had mastered that science process skill of observation at an appropriate level for their grade? If we took the science and engineering practice of evaluating data or analyzing data, at their grade level, what evidence would we need to see to say this child has mastered at evaluating or analyzing data? At a 3rd grade level, maybe that would be that they can look at a graph and make a conclusion from that graph and articulate that to you, that now we're not making a content assessment, we're making a skill assessment. For the process skills, your book gives a sample assessment. In my book, it's figure 8.3. For inquiry, they have a checklist report, 8.7. There also are useful tools, these are useful tools that you could adapt to match the goals of the school where you work. So if the school that you're working in is using newer science and engineering practices from the K-12, the framework for K-12 science education, you could adapt the process skill statements to the science and engineering practices. There's some significant overlap. Or if you have a local curriculum or a local report card, you could adapt them for that. There's also an inquiry rubric in 8.14 that you could use for assessing inquiry skills. So that's just something to remember, that in addition to the science content, we really want to make sure we have a formal process for assessing whether or not our students have the skills, because in many ways those are the more important thing for our students to walk away from our classroom with. They can always kind of learn more content later, but those skills are what we use to learn the content. So we want to make sure we're ensuring that our students know how to do science and have those process skills down, or the practices down. I've given you a few examples of rubrics in this class, like the claims, evidence, and reasoning rubric and the reading and writing week. Your book has some good examples of rubrics as well. I'd encourage you to use Google to help you find other rubrics and refine the ones that you have. And I'm not going to go through a whole lesson in how to write a rubric. Writing a rubric for science isn't really any different than other subject areas. And I trust that in your other methods courses or your other education coursework, you've had some instruction in creating rubrics. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to seek that out. The reason that rubrics are so powerful is they provide an opportunity for metacognition and self-regulation, and in many ways, the rubric itself is a formative assessment for students to use during their learning process. They do this because they make these really clear statements about the purpose of the assessment and the exact criteria for grading. So a student is able to say, I am not able to do a 3 on this rubric, I need to do something else. And they're able to actually seek out your help or help from a peer. This is really important as we look at ways of grading that aren't multiple choice tests. So in that activity where you were looking at different authentic activities or authentic assessments, when we're looking at those, we really want to make sure that we have a rubric that makes our expectations clear. In your lesson plan, you need to acknowledge some things about learner differences. And as you finish up your final drafts of those lesson plans, I encourage you to think about the suggestions that the book has. In my book, it's 8.12. There's a chart that has some fantastic statements about ways to adapt assessment for different learners. And this is a really, really important thing. If the point of assessment is being able to show you what I know or what my skill is, sometimes the shape of the assessment itself determines how well students will do on it. Even they may absolutely know the content, or they may absolutely be proficient in the practice that you're trying to assess. But if your assessment practice, your assessment technique itself gets in the way of them showing that, then it's not going to be an appropriate assessment for that child. I think about a lot of times the students that I had in my class who, even at the high school level, they struggled to demonstrate their knowledge of content because they really struggled with writing. So if I'm giving them a poor grade on content and I haven't given them a way to show it to me other than writing, I'm probably not giving them a fair assessment. So think about the list in your book on 8.12. Think about ways that you can incorporate that into your lesson plan for that piece where you're asked to think about differentiating the learning. Also, you can go back to the Universal Design for Learning site that I sent you to, or other materials about differentiated instruction to think about assessment specifically. This week you have 5 forum post questions. One is the activity about authentic assessments where you select 2 and explain how you would use them. One is the formative assessment where you select 3 and explain how you'll use them. There's a question for each of the videos that you watch. You're going to watch 2 videos that relate to the formative assessment section of this. In Show Your Cards, you see an example of informal formative assessment. I want you to think about whether you liked or didn't like this method. I think it's completely valid to fall down on either side of that question. I just want you to articulate, if you liked it, what you thought was really good about it, and if you felt uncomfortable with it, what made you uncomfortable, and what is another way that you could get at that same thing. In creating burglar alarms while learning circuitry, you're going to see a group of students doing a pretty open-ended lab, and the teacher is using that lab as assessment. And I want you to explain to me how they're using that as assessment. I hope that you'll be able to gain some insight as you watch this and how to plan for assessments like this. And then finally, your book includes a few checklists, rubrics, and assessment guides for things other than content. What are the advantages and disadvantages of assessing things like process, practice, inquiry, and safety? And then what do you plan to do in your classroom? We can kind of think back to in the beginning when we stated our statements of our mission statements for teaching science. When we go back to that idea of what I want to do as a science teacher, how does this other piece of assessing things other than content fit in? And how do you hope to fulfill that? I hope you have a great week. As always, email me if you have questions.